Tyler Brooks stood in the hallway outside his apartment door, holding an envelope that didn't belong in his world. There was no return address, no stamp, nothing printed at all. Just his name, written in ink so precise it looked typed, and a wax seal pressed into the corner like something out of another century. His hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. 3 weeks earlier, he had lost the only job keeping his family afloat. 3 weeks earlier, he had done the one thing his manager told him never to do. He had treated a stranger like a human being, in a room full of people who had already decided that stranger wasn't worth the trouble. Standing in that hallway, staring at a seal he didn't recognize, Tyler Brooks had no idea that this single envelope was about to undo every assumption anyone had ever made about him, about the man he'd helped, and about what kindness is actually worth when nobody's watching to reward it. Before we go back to where this all started, I want you to do something for me. If you've ever been judged by how you looked, what you had in your bank account, or what people assumed about you the second you walked into a room, this story is about to feel personal. Hit that subscribe button right now, because by the end of this video, you're going to want to see exactly how this ends. And while you're at it, drop a comment and tell me, have you ever stood up for someone everyone else looked straight past? Now let's go back. 3 weeks earlier, before the envelope, before the firing, before any of it, Tyler Brooks was just a man trying to keep his family standing upright. Tyler had worked at the Aldridge for 6 years. It was the kind of restaurant where the tablecloths were pressed daily and the wine list cost more to print than most people's weekly grocery bill. Marble floors, low gold lighting. The kind of place where a $30 appetizer didn't raise an eyebrow from anyone in the room. Tyler didn't come from that world, and he never pretended to. What he had was something the restaurant couldn't train into anyone. He remembered names. He remembered which regular liked their steak a touch past medium, which old widower came in every single Thursday, just so he wouldn't have to eat alone, which exhausted young parents needed their coffee refilled before they even had to ask. People didn't just tip Tyler well. They requested his section by name, week after week, year after year. At 34 years old, Tyler was raising his daughter Naomi by himself. Her mother had died 3 years earlier after a short illness that took her faster than anyone in the family was ready for, and since then it had been just the two of them, plus his mother, Vivian, who helped however her body would still let her. Vivian Brooks had raised Tyler alone too, after his father Walter passed away when Tyler was only 12. Walter hadn't left his son much in the way of money, but he had left him something else entirely, something Tyler still carried with him every single day of his life. Tyler remembered the afternoon his father told him the story, the two of them walking home in worn-out shoes after Walter had been turned away from a restaurant downtown for not looking like he belonged there. No table available, the host had said, glancing past him into a half-empty dining room. Walter never raised his voice about it. He just looked down at his son and said the words that would shape the rest of Tyler's life. The way you treat someone with nothing tells the world everything about what you actually have. Tyler was 12 years old standing on that sidewalk, and he never forgot a single word of it. That lesson quietly shaped the kind of server and the kind of man Tyler became. Walter Brooks had worked nights at a freight warehouse for most of Tyler's childhood, coming home just as the sun came up, smelling like motor oil and cold air, always finding the energy to ask his son how school had gone before he collapsed into bed for a few hours of sleep. He never had much. He never complained about it either. The night the restaurant turned him away, Walter had been trying to take Tyler out for his birthday with whatever cash he'd managed to set aside that month, and the host's glance, the quick up-and-down assessment of his worn jacket and his tired eyes, had told Walter everything he needed to know before a single word was even spoken. Walter didn't argue. He simply turned around, took his son's hand, and walked them both toward the diner 2 blocks over instead, the one that never once made anyone feel small for ordering off the cheap side of the menu. It wasn't the rejection itself that stuck with Tyler all these years later. It was the calm in his father's voice afterward, completely unbothered, completely certain of his own worth regardless of what any host's glance had decided about him. Most mornings now, Tyler was up before Naomi, making her lunch for school while she still slept, laying out her clothes the way she liked them, the small invisible labor of a single father trying to make sure his daughter's mornings stayed soft even when his own life wasn't. He'd drop her off at school, drive to the restaurant, put on the same calm face for 10 hours straight no matter what was happening underneath it, then come home and do it all over again the next day. Nobody at the Aldridge knew the full weight of what he carried home with him every single night. He never let them see it. That wasn't who he was. A few months before any of this happened, on a freezing night after closing, Tyler had noticed an older man sitting on the curb outside the restaurant with nothing but a thin blanket and a cardboard sign. Tyler had gone back inside, packed up the untouched bread basket and the soup of the day that nobody had ordered, and brought it out to him without telling a single soul. He never mentioned it to anyone, not even his closest friend at work. It wasn't the kind of thing he did for credit. It was simply the kind of thing he did, the way some people breathe without thinking about it. There was also an elderly widower named Mr. Whitfield who came in every Thursday at noon, always alone, always ordering the same roasted chicken his late wife used to make for him at home before she passed away. Most servers treated him like a quick table to turn over and forget. Tyler always gave him the full hour he clearly needed, refilling his coffee without being asked twice, asking about his week even when the answer was always some quiet version of nothing much. "You're the only one who doesn't rush me out the door, son," Mr. Whitfield told him once, pressing an extra $10 into his hand that Tyler tried politely to refuse. It wasn't charity Tyler was offering that man. It was attention, the kind that costs absolutely nothing and somehow means everything to a person eating alone. Now, here's where things started to get heavy. Vivian's kidneys were failing. She needed dialysis 3 times a week, the kind of treatment that left her gray and exhausted for hours afterward, barely able to lift a cup of water on her own. The doctors said she needed a transplant before the damage became permanent and irreversible, and the hospital bill was stacking up faster than Tyler's tips could possibly keep pace with. He'd sat with her at the dialysis center just the week before, watching that machine quietly do the work her body could no longer do on its own, and she'd squeezed his hand and told him not to worry about her, the way mothers do, even when there's every reason in the world to worry. He hadn't told Naomi how serious it was. He hadn't told anyone at work the full truth either, except for the one person who always seemed to know something was wrong before he ever said a word out loud. Renee Hayes had been waiting tables at the Aldridge almost as long as Tyler had. She was raising 2 kids of her own on a single income, and somewhere in the chaos of double shifts and short-staffed Saturday nights, she and Tyler had become the kind of friends who didn't need much explanation between them. She covered for him when Vivian had a bad night. He covered for her when her car wouldn't start. It was a small kindness economy, built quietly between 2 people who understood exactly how thin the margin was between getting by and falling apart completely. "You look tired," Renee told him one morning before the doors opened, watching him fold napkins with the kind of focus people use to avoid talking about what's actually wrong. "I'm fine," Tyler said. "You're never fine when you say it that fast," she answered. He didn't say anything back to that. He didn't have to. Renee had been there long enough to know that Tyler Brooks would rather carry the weight silently than put it on anyone else's shoulders. The restaurant's general manager, a man named David Pierce, ran the floor like someone perpetually worried that an important person was watching his every move. And often, someone was. Pierce had built his entire career on managing perception. Who got seated by the window, who got the best server in the building, and, more quietly, who didn't get seated at all. There was no sign on the door, no written policy anywhere, just an understanding that the staff absorbed the way you absorb the weather. The Aldridge maintained a certain image, and David Pierce considered himself its personal guardian. "We're not a soup kitchen," he'd say, whenever a guest came through the door who didn't fit the part he had in mind. He never said it loud enough for the dining room itself to hear, just loud enough for the staff to understand exactly what was expected of them. A few weeks before any of this, Tyler had watched Pierce turn away a woman in hospital scrubs who'd come straight from a double shift, still in her work clothes, just wanting a quiet dinner by herself. "We do recommend more business casual attire for our dining room," Pierce had told her, smiling the entire time, and the woman simply nodded and walked back out rather than make a scene out of her own exhaustion. Tyler hadn't said anything that day. He needed the job too badly to risk it. But it sat with him for days afterward, the way certain small cruelties tend to. Richard Ashford, who owned the Aldridge along with 2 other locations across the city, didn't involve himself in the daily grind of running a dining room. He showed up a handful of times a year, usually with investors trailing behind him, there to be reassured that his money was being looked after by someone who understood exactly what mattered: tablecloths, wine margins, and the comfort of people who could afford both without thinking twice. Ashford wasn't a cruel man, not really. He was simply a man who had built a habit of looking away from anything that might complicate the numbers on his spreadsheet. He told himself the restaurant's culture was Pierce's department, and that made it considerably easier not to ask too many questions about how exactly that culture got enforced on a day-to-day basis. What nobody at the Aldridge knew, not even Tyler, was that a quiet man in an unremarkable car had spent 2 separate afternoons that month sitting in the restaurant's parking lot, watching the staff come and go, taking note of who treated the delivery drivers with respect and who didn't, who held the door for elderly guests, and who let it swing shut in their faces. He wasn't there for the food. He worked for Eli Calloway, and his only job was finding restaurants worth Calloway's personal attention. He had already flagged Tyler's name in a small notebook 3 days before that old man ever walked through the front door. That particular Thursday, Ashford was due in for a quarterly walkthrough. Pierce had been reminding the entire staff all week, the way a man reminds people of a test he's far more nervous about than they are. Nobody on that floor had any idea yet that this Thursday was about to become the single most important day of Tyler Brooks's entire life. The lunch rush had just started filling the dining room when the front door opened and an old man walked in. He didn't look like anyone else at the Aldridge that day. His coat was thin for the weather outside, fraying badly at the cuffs. His shoes were scuffed clean through at the toe. White stubble covered a face that looked like it had spent a very long time out in the elements, and his eyes moved carefully around the room the way people move when they're used to being told to leave before they've even managed to sit down. The young hostess, a girl named Brittany, hesitated at the sight of him and instinctively looked over her shoulder for Pierce. Pierce, standing near the host stand reviewing the reservation list ahead of Ashford's arrival, looked up, and his expression shifted in less than a single second. "Sir," Pierce said, stepping forward before the old man had even taken 3 full steps inside, "I think you might have the wrong place." "I was hoping to get something hot to eat," the man said quietly. "It's cold out there." "This is a reservation-based dining room," Pierce said, his voice pitched low but his entire body angled toward the door, the universal language of get out before you cause a scene. A few nearby guests had already noticed. Whispers started, the kind that travel through a room faster than any waitstaff can move plates. A man at the bar muttered something to his date and laughed quietly under his breath. Brittany busied herself rearranging menus she didn't actually need to rearrange, unwilling to even meet the old man's eyes. Can you imagine that? Being hungry, walking into a room full of warm food, and being told there's no room for you. Not because there isn't a table free, but simply because of how you look standing in the doorway? The old man didn't argue with any of it. He simply asked, "Is there anywhere I could sit? I do have money for a meal." "I'm sure you understand," Pierce said, in that particular tone people use when they want a sentence to sound polite while making absolutely certain that it isn't. That was the exact moment Tyler stepped in. "I've got an open table in my section," he said, already pulling out a chair before Pierce could say another word. "Right this way, sir." Pierce's jaw tightened. "Tyler," he started. "I've got it," Tyler said, and walked the old man to a quiet table near the window, the one usually reserved for regulars who tipped generously and never caused trouble. He treated him exactly the way he treated every other guest who walked through those doors. Pulled out the chair himself, handed him a menu, asked if he wanted something warm to start, recommended the soup because it happened to be the best thing on the menu and also the cheapest, and refilled his water glass before he even had to ask for it. "Why are you doing this?" the old man asked quietly, watching Tyler with an attention that felt different from most customers, sharper, almost like he was paying close attention to something far beyond the menu in front of him. "Everyone else in this room looked at me like I was invisible." Tyler shrugged, like it was the simplest thing in the world to explain. "My father used to tell me the way you treat someone with nothing tells the world everything you actually have," he said. "I've never been able to forget it." "Your father sounds like he was a wise man," the old man said. "He was a tired man who worked 2 jobs and still found time to teach me things," Tyler answered. "I think that's its own kind of wisdom, honestly." The old man smiled at that, just slightly. "What's your name, son?" "Tyler. Tyler Brooks." "Eli," the old man said, offering nothing else about himself. "Just Eli." They talked a little more as the meal went on, Nothing important, the kind of small conversation Tyler had with dozens of guests every single week. Except this time the old man seemed to be listening harder than most people ever did. He asked about Tyler's family. Tyler mentioned his daughter, careful not to bring up his mother's illness to a complete stranger, though something about the man's quiet patience almost made him want to. The old man didn't say much about himself in return. He just ate slowly, like someone who hadn't had a hot meal in longer than he wanted to admit out loud, and watched the restaurant move around him with careful, observant eyes. When the bill finally came, his card was declined. It happened at the exact moment Richard Ashford walked through the front door with two investors trailing behind him, exactly the kind of audience Pierce had been dreading building toward all week long. "Card's not going through," the old man said, clearly embarrassed, reaching for a worn-out wallet that obviously didn't have a backup plan tucked inside it. "I'm sorry. Let me try it again." Pierce saw his opening, and he took it without a moment's hesitation. "Get him out," Pierce hissed at Tyler, low enough that Ashford wouldn't hear it directly, but loud enough that the message landed unmistakably. "Now, before Mr. Ashford sees any of this." "He just needs a minute, David," Tyler said. "We don't have a minute," Pierce snapped back. "Handle it." Tyler looked at the old man's face, not embarrassed for himself in that moment, but for the inconvenience he genuinely believed he was causing everyone around him, and Tyler made a decision that would end his career inside the next 4 minutes. He reached into his own pocket, pulled out two $20 bills from his own tip money, the same money that was supposed to go toward his mother's hospital bill that very week, and laid it down flat on the table. "It's covered," Tyler said. "Lunch is on me today." The old man looked up at him, and for just a moment there was something in his eyes that didn't match the rest of him at all. Something sharp, something assessing, gone again almost as fast as it had appeared. "I won't forget this," he said quietly, and rose from the table to leave, nodding once to Tyler before walking back out into the cold. Pierce had watched every second of that exchange, and the moment the old man stepped out the door, his face had gone the color of old paper. Ashford, just a few feet away, had clearly caught the tail end of it too. The declined card, the awkward exit, the murmur it had already stirred among the nearby tables. "My office," Pierce said. "Now, what would you have done in Tyler's position? Knowing your job is the only thing keeping your family's lights on. Would you have walked away from someone everyone else in the room had already decided wasn't worth the trouble?" In that office, the conversation didn't take very long, because Pierce had already decided exactly how it would end before Tyler even sat down. "You embarrassed this restaurant in front of Mr. Ashford," Pierce said. "In front of investors." "I helped a hungry man get a meal," Tyler said. "That's the job. Your job is to maintain the standard of this dining room." "He wasn't hurting anybody, David." Pierce's voice dropped, and for a second the practiced calm slipped away entirely. "You don't get to decide who belongs in this restaurant." "I do." "Funny," Tyler said, quieter now, "because I always thought the customer decided that the second they walked through the door." It was the kind of line that felt good to say and cost absolutely everything to say. Pierce's face went tight. "You're done here," he said. "Effective immediately. I'll have your last check mailed to you." "On what grounds?" "Insubordination. Conduct unbecoming of the standards of this establishment." Pierce was already reaching for a pre-written write-up form, the kind of small detail that told Tyler this decision hadn't been made in the last 4 minutes at all. It had been sitting there, waiting for an excuse to use it. Renee was standing near the office door when Tyler walked out, and she didn't even need to ask what had happened. She could see it written all over his face. "He can't do that," she said. "Not for that. Not after what you just did for that man." "He just did," Tyler said. She reached for his arm. "Tyler, your mom." "I know," he said, and those two words carried more weight than either of them wanted to say out loud in the middle of a restaurant hallway. He gathered his apron and his name tag from the back, the same name tag he had worn proudly for 6 straight years, and walked out through the kitchen rather than the dining room, unwilling to give Pierce the satisfaction of watching him leave through the front door in defeat. Think about that for a second. 6 years of remembering names, remembering orders, remembering people nobody else bothered to remember, gone in the space of a 4-minute conversation. How many of you have given somewhere everything you had, only to be shown the door the moment it became inconvenient for someone above you? Outside in the parking lot, he ran into Mrs. Caldwell, a longtime regular he'd served for years, The kind of woman who tipped generously and always asked about Naomi by name without fail. She must have seen something written on his face. "Tyler, everything all right? Just had my last shift here, ma'am," he said, trying his best to keep his voice light. Her face fell immediately. "That's a shame. You were the only reason I kept coming back to this place at all." She pressed something into his hand before he could even think to decline it. Far more money than a simple tip should ever have been, and told him to take good care of that little girl of his. It wasn't enough to fix anything that was happening in his life, but it was enough, for just a moment, to remind him that the way he had treated people for 6 years hadn't gone completely unnoticed, even if David Pierce had decided none of it mattered in the end. He drove home that evening with the radio off entirely, replaying the conversation over and over, replaying the exact moment he laid 2 20s down on a stranger's table, knowing full well what kind of week he was already having financially. He didn't regret it. That was the strange part of all this. Somewhere underneath the fear of what was coming next, there was a stillness inside him that felt exactly like his father's voice, telling him he had done the one and only thing that actually mattered. When he got home, Naomi ran to the door the way she always did. "You're home early." "Yeah, baby," Tyler said, scooping her up into his arms, keeping his voice steady. "Got off early today." He didn't tell her the truth that night. 2 days later, when Vivian called asking why he'd been home so much, he finally told her everything. The old man, the declined card, the 2 $20 bills, Pierce's office, all of it, laid out plainly. He braced himself for worry, maybe even disappointment given the timing of it all. Instead, Vivian reached over and took his hand in both of hers. "You did exactly what your father would have done," she told him. "I'm not going to sit here and tell you that you should have kept your job and your mouth shut, because that's not the son I raised, and it's not the kind of man your daughter needs to grow up watching every single day. Mama, the bills will work themselves out the way they always have," she said. "What won't work itself out is you turning into someone who looks away from people. We'll figure it out. We always do somehow." It didn't fix anything that night, not really. The hospital bills were still sitting there in the morning. The job search was still empty. Vivian still needed a transplant the family couldn't yet afford. But it helped, in the way that being fully known and understood by someone always helps, even when nothing else around you has actually changed. He sat at the kitchen table after they had both gone to bed, staring down at a stack of bills he no longer had an income to match, and wondered exactly how long he could keep holding all of it together before something finally gave way. The next 2 weeks were the kind that test exactly what a person is truly made of. Tyler applied to every serving and bartending job within 20 miles of his apartment. A bistro downtown said they'd already filled the position, even though the listing was still posted 3 days later when he checked again. A hotel restaurant told him he was overqualified for the role, then never called back about anything else they might have had open. A bar manager looked over his 6 solid years at the Aldrich, asked why he had left, and grew visibly uncomfortable the moment Tyler told him the actual truth. The hospital called twice about Vivian's mounting balance, each call more insistent than the last. "We understand circumstances change," the billing coordinator said gently the second time around, "but we do need to discuss a payment plan before the next round of treatment begins." Tyler told her he was working on it, without knowing exactly how that was going to become true in any real sense. He started picking up odd shifts wherever he possibly could, moving furniture for a neighbor down the hall, driving late into the night for a rideshare app after Naomi had already gone to sleep. Anything that wouldn't require explaining why his last job had ended the way it did. It was during one of those long, exhausting nights, sitting outside a downtown bar waiting for his next ride request to come through, that he found himself wondering whether any of it was even going to be enough in time. He'd come home well past midnight, count out the night's earnings against the next bill due, and sleep maybe 4 hours before doing the entire thing over again the next day. The very next morning, while he was trying to sleep off that exhaustion, Naomi's school called. Her teacher said she had seemed distracted in class lately, quieter than usual, and had mentioned to a friend that her daddy seemed sad. Tyler sat on the edge of his bed for a long time after that call ended. He had thought he was protecting her by not saying anything about what was really going on. He was starting to understand that kids notice absolutely everything anyway, whether you say a single word to them or not. That evening, he made sure to be home for dinner, no rideshare app open on his phone, no bills spread out across the table in front of him. He let Naomi talk his ear off about her entire day, asked her 3 different follow-up questions about a friend's upcoming birthday party, and made her laugh hard enough that the sound of it nearly undid him completely. It wasn't a solution to a single one of his problems. It was simply a reminder of exactly what he was fighting so hard to hold on to. Vivian noticed the strain even though he tried his best to hide it from her. "You don't have to do this entirely alone. You know," she told him one evening, her voice thinner than it used to sound. "I can always ask the church for some help." "You're not asking anybody for anything, Mama," he said. "I've got this handled." She looked at him the way mothers look at sons who are clearly lying just to make them feel better, but she let it go without pushing any further. Then, halfway into the second week, Renee called him with something strange running through her voice. "2 men in suits came into the restaurant today," she said, "asking questions. About you." "About me? What kind of questions?" "I don't know exactly." Pierce wouldn't say, but he looked like he'd seen a ghost the entire time they were there. "And Ashford's been in and out twice this week already, which never, ever happens." She paused for a long moment. "Tyler, something's going on. I don't know what it is, but it feels big." After she hung up the phone with Tyler, Renee couldn't quite let it go. She found Pierce in the back office later that same afternoon, pretending to organize a stack of invoices he clearly wasn't actually reading. "Who were those men?" she asked him directly. "None of your concern," Pierce said. "Does it have something to do with Tyler?" Pierce's hands stilled over the papers for just a second too long to be nothing. "Get back out to the floor, Renee. You fired the best server this restaurant has ever had," she said, "over an old man and $40. If this ever comes back around on you, I hope you remember exactly why." She didn't get an answer out of him. She didn't really need one. Something in Pierce's face had already told her everything she needed to know. Tyler had bigger things to worry about than any of that, though, things that felt far more urgent than office gossip. A transplant deadline that wasn't moving an inch, a daughter who kept asking when he'd be home for dinner the way he used to be, a mother trying so hard to stay strong in front of a son she could tell was barely holding the entire thing together. Then, on a Tuesday morning, there was a knock at his door. A courier stood there holding a single envelope. No company logo anywhere on it. No tracking number. Just Tyler's name written in precise handwriting and a wax seal he didn't recognize at all. "Tyler Brooks?" the courier asked. "That's me. This is for you," he said, and left without another single word, like he had somewhere else important to be and absolutely no interest in explaining any part of this further. Tyler stood in that hallway for a long moment before he finally opened it. This is the exact moment we started this entire story with, his hands shaking, no idea in the world what was waiting for him inside. Now, if you've made it this far, I need you to stay with me, because everything is about to change in a way you will not see coming. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time, because the next few minutes are going to flip this entire story on its head. And I want to ask you something honest before we keep going. If you lost your job for doing the right thing, with bills piling up and a family depending on you, would you do it again anyway? Let me know down in the comments. Now, back to that hallway, and that envelope, and everything it was about to reveal. Inside was a letter, handwritten, and it began like this. "Tyler, you don't know my name, but you fed me when no one else in that room would even look at me. My name is Eli Calloway." Tyler sat down right there in the hallway. The letter explained everything in careful, deliberate sentences. Eli Calloway was one of the most private and successful businessmen in the entire country, a man who had built an empire from absolutely nothing, and who, for the better part of 2 decades, had made a quiet personal habit of testing the character of people before ever trusting them with anything that truly mattered to him. He dressed down on purpose. He let himself be dismissed on purpose. He watched, carefully and patiently, for the rare person who treated him with dignity when every incentive in the room pointed in the opposite direction entirely. In all his years of doing this, the letter said, almost no one had ever responded the way Tyler had, reaching into his own pocket with so little left to spare, in order to cover a complete stranger's meal without a single second of hesitation. The letter went on to say that Vivian's surgery had already been paid for in full, arranged quietly through the hospital that very same week, and that her transplant would now move forward without any further delay whatsoever. And it revealed something else entirely, that Calloway had just finalized the acquisition of the entire Ashford Restaurant Group, The Aldridge included, effective immediately. He wanted to meet Tyler in person. There was an address included. A specific time, the very next morning. Tyler read that letter twice, then a third time, before he allowed himself to even trust that any of it could be real. He called the hospital directly to confirm what the letter was claiming, half expecting the whole thing to turn out to be some kind of mistake or elaborate scam, and the billing coordinator on the other end of the line told him, with audible confusion of her own, that Vivian's entire account had indeed been settled in full that very morning by an anonymous benefactor she couldn't explain. That night, Naomi found him sitting at the kitchen table again, except this time he wasn't staring down at a single bill. "Daddy, what's wrong?" she asked, climbing up into the chair across from him. "Nothing's wrong, baby," he said, and smiled. And for the first time in weeks, it wasn't a smile he had to force onto his face. "I think everything's about to change. I think it's good." The address led Tyler to an office building downtown that he had walked past 100 times in his life without ever knowing what was actually inside it. When the elevator doors opened, Eli Calloway was already waiting for him, and he looked nothing at all like the man from the restaurant. No worn coat, no scuffed shoes, just a tailored suit and the same careful eyes that had quietly watched Tyler from across a lunch table 2 weeks earlier. "I have to apologize for the deception," Calloway said, shaking his hand firmly. "It's the only way I have ever found out the truth about people." He told Tyler the rest of it himself, sitting across a desk instead of a dining table this time. He had grown up with absolutely nothing, the son of a single mother who cleaned houses for a living just to get by. As a young man, during the single worst week of his entire life, he had once been turned away from a diner by someone who looked at his ragged clothes and decided in an instant that he wasn't worth the trouble of serving. He never forgot that moment for the rest of his life. And once he had built enough wealth that he would never have to worry about a declined card again, he made himself a quiet promise. He would never hand his legacy or his trust to anyone who treated other people the exact same way he had once been treated. "In 6 years of doing this," Calloway said, "you are the only person who has ever paid for my meal out of their own pocket. Everyone else either looked away entirely or called security on me. A few of them handed me a job application, like that solves anything at all in the actual moment it's happening. One man, the manager of a steakhouse much like this one, actually had me escorted out by 2 off-duty police officers he'd hired for exactly that purpose. Another woman, a server at a diner outside the city, slipped me a free coffee and nothing else, looking over her shoulder the entire time like dignity itself might get her fired. You just pulled out a chair for me, without checking who was watching first. I didn't know who you were," Tyler said. "It wouldn't have changed a single thing if I had." That, Calloway said, is exactly why it matters so much. I've spent 20 years building something I refuse to hand over to people who only behave well when they think it's being noticed. You weren't performing for anyone in that room. You were just being yourself. That's worth more to me than every spreadsheet my accountants have ever put in front of me." Tyler didn't know what to say back to that, so for a long moment he didn't say anything at all. Calloway stood up from behind his desk. "Let's go pay David Pierce a visit," he said. They walked back into the Aldridge together that very afternoon, and the moment David Pierce saw the old man's face sitting above that tailored suit, every bit of blood drained out of his own. Renee, clearing a nearby table at that exact moment, froze completely mid-motion, her eyes darting back and forth between the old man from 2 weeks earlier and the man now standing beside Tyler in a suit that probably cost more than her entire monthly rent. Brittany, the young hostess who had looked away rather than meet Calloway's eyes 2 weeks before, stood frozen near the host's stand with a stack of menus pressed tightly against her chest, looking like she very badly wanted to be anywhere else in the building at that moment. Near the window, Mr. Whitfield, in for his usual Thursday lunch, watched the entire scene unfold with quiet satisfaction, almost as if some part of him had always suspected Tyler's kindness would eventually find its way back around to him. "Mr. Calloway," Ashford said, stumbling badly over the name, already reaching out to shake his hand, his voice climbing into the register men use when they sensed the ground shifting violently beneath their feet. "We had no idea. If we had only known who you were, of course we would have." "That's exactly the problem," Calloway said. "You would have treated me completely differently if you had known who I was. That tells me everything I need to know about how this restaurant actually treats the people it doesn't think matter." Ashford's mouth opened and closed without producing anything useful at all. For the first time in years, he looked less like a man reviewing quarterly margins and more like a man being forced to genuinely look at exactly what he had allowed to be built underneath him. Calloway turned to face the staff gathered near the host's stand, his voice calm, but easily carrying across the entire dining room. As of this morning, he said, I own this restaurant and the company behind it. David Pierce, you are terminated, effective immediately, for the way you treated a man you assumed had nothing, and for firing the one employee who treated him like he actually mattered. Pierce opened his mouth, found absolutely nothing to say, and closed it again. You can't just, he finally managed to get out. I just did, Calloway answered simply. Tyler Brooks, Calloway continued, turning back toward him, is the new general manager of the Aldrich, with a real ownership stake in this location going forward, if he's willing to take it. The entire dining room had gone completely silent. A few guests, sensing they were witnessing something they couldn't quite fully follow, had stopped eating altogether. Renee's hand had found its way to her mouth. Ashford, to his actual credit, didn't try to argue his way out of the moment. He asked, quietly, if there might be a way to stay involved with the company going forward, not as someone untouched by the consequences of what had happened, but as someone genuinely willing to learn from all of it. Calloway told him that would depend entirely on what he did next, starting with exactly how he treated every single person who walked through that door from this point forward, regardless of what they looked like or what was sitting in their wallet. Ashford nodded, and for once in his life, he actually looked like he meant it. Pierce, who had spent his entire career deciding exactly who belonged in a room and who didn't with nothing more than a single glance, walked out through the same door he had once tried to push an old man through, carrying a small box of his desk belongings under one arm. He paused at the threshold for just a second, glancing back at Tyler one last time, and for the briefest moment something close to shame crossed his face before he disappeared out into the parking lot for good. Nobody in that dining room moved to stop him. Nobody felt the need to. Renee finally found her voice once the door had closed behind him. I knew there was something different about that man, she said quietly, mostly to herself. I just never imagined this. Calloway turned to her with something almost like warmth in his expression. You stayed loyal to him when it cost you nothing to look the other way, he said. That matters more than you probably realize. Renee didn't have an answer for that either. She simply nodded, blinking back something she didn't want to explain in front of a room full of stunned guests. Vivian's surgery went smoothly. She came home 3 weeks later steadier than she had been in well over a year, and the very first thing she did was hug her son so tightly that he had to remind her to actually breathe. I always told you, she said, holding his face gently in both her hands, that the Lord doesn't forget kindness. He just takes his own time showing you exactly how. Renee got the promotion to assistant manager that she had honestly earned years before anyone in that building had bothered to notice, and she cried in the back office the moment Tyler told her. The good kind of crying, the kind that only comes after years of quietly being overlooked. Under Tyler's leadership, the Aldrich started something it had never once done before. One night every single week, the restaurant opened its doors for free meals to anyone who needed one. No reservation required, no dress code enforced, no exceptions made, no questions asked at the door whatsoever. Tyler named that night after his father, quietly, on a small plaque near the entrance that most guests never even noticed, but that meant absolutely everything to him personally. A local paper picked up the story a few months later, not the entire truth of how it had actually started, but enough of it. A former waiter turned co-owner who had built a weekly tradition out of feeding anyone who walked through the door hungry. The story spread further than Tyler ever expected it to, and for a little while, people came from across the entire city just to see the restaurant that had decided dignity wasn't some kind of luxury item reserved for paying customers only. A few weeks into the new routine, Naomi came home from school with an assignment asking her to write about someone she admired. She wrote about her father, about a story she only half understood yet, about an old man and a chair and a lesson her grandfather had taught a long time before she was even born. Her teacher read it out loud to the class without using any names, and 3 other kids in that room said it reminded them of someone in their own family. Tyler kept that paper folded in his wallet for months afterward, long after the creases started to wear through. 1 year later, the Aldrich looked different in ways that had absolutely nothing to do with the decor on its walls. The Thursday free meal night had grown so large that the restaurant had to bring on extra staff just to manage it. Every single one of them paid fairly. Every single one of them trained personally by Tyler on the one rule that mattered more than any other. Every person who walks through that door gets treated exactly the same. Full stop. No exceptions. Mr. Whitfield still came in every Thursday at noon, though now he sometimes brought a friend along from his building, someone else who had been eating alone for far too long. Brittany, the once frozen young hostess, had grown into one of the most attentive people on the entire staff, having learned more from watching what happened to Pierce than any training manual could possibly have taught her. David Pierce never worked in fine dining again. Word travels fast in a small industry, and the story of what happened at the Aldrich, at least the parts of it that eventually became public, followed him to every single interview he tried to land afterward. Tyler never wished the man any harm. He simply never had to think about him again, which turned out to be its own quiet kind of justice in the end. Richard Ashford stayed on with the company, true to his word, though the man who returned to it a year later barely resembled the one who had once let his general manager run an entire dining room purely on instinct alone. He sat in personally on the Thursday dinners now, serving water right alongside the rest of the staff, something he had insisted on doing himself, without anyone having to ask. Vivian Brooks attended every single one of those Thursday nights that her health would allow, usually seated near the very same window, watching her son hand out plates with the exact same care he had once shown a stranger with a decline card and nothing else to his name in the entire world. Tyler sat across the kitchen table from Naomi on a quiet evening, helping her with homework, the bills no longer stacked up in the corner where he used to stare at them long into the night. "Dad," she asked, "why do you always smile when you talk about that old man from the restaurant?" Tyler thought about it for a second, about his father walking him home in worn-out shoes all those years ago, about the lesson that took 20 years to finally pay him back, about a stranger with a declined card who turned out to be quietly testing the entire world for the one thing money has never once been able to buy. "Because he reminded me of something your grandfather taught me a very long time ago," Tyler told her. "The way you treat someone with nothing tells the world everything you actually have. I want you to remember that, even when nobody's watching. Especially when nobody's watching." Naomi nodded the way kids do when they don't fully understand something yet, but somehow already know the words matter, and went back to her homework. In a world that so often measures people by what they appear to own, by what's sitting in their wallet, by the clothes on their back when they walk through a door, it's worth asking yourself something honest right now. How would you have treated the man at that table? Would you have looked past him the same way everyone else in that room did? Or would you have pulled out the chair for him the way Tyler did? If this story moved you even a little bit, do me one favor before you go. Like this video, subscribe for more stories exactly like this one, and tell me down in the comments, would you have pulled out the chair?